Good morning from the brutal, reactionary, heartless, capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, well, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should also be having an amazing day. If you've ever scrolled through a Twitter feed of an American progressive, and I use the term very loosely, progressive page, you will find that many times these people often reminisce about the 1950s, right? Despite the fact that the 50s was also the era of segregation, Jim Crow, and vicious racism to anyone who wasn't a white, straight Christian, for example, you'll find that these so-called progressive Americans seem to really fantasize about the halcyon good old days when a man with one salary could afford to feed, clothe, and educate his children. And now it's getting too difficult in order to support a family in America, right? Of course, even a cursory analysis on how capitalism works would lead you to the conclusion that late-stage capitalism is what we're currently living in, basically. Capitalism at its peak happened in the 1950s, right? That was as good as it would get for white upper-middle-class Americans. But now, America can no longer hope to go back to the standard of living that was possible for white middle-class Americans in the 1950s, simply because in order to maintain that standard of living, America had to basically do it at the expense of the global South, or in other words, the third world, the so-called third world, right? Because in order to maintain that madman sort of lifestyle of the white picket fence and the father and wife and children living happily, someone had to pay for it. And guess who was paying for it? Yes, we in the global South were paying for it with your brutal resource extraction as well as value extraction, which made it possible to maintain that standard of living, including human resources, because even people, as a result of constant destabilization and destruction of the global South, even human resources like the best and brightest minds ended up shifting over to America, in order to seek a better life and take back some of the dragon's hoard, basically, the proverbial dragon's hoard. But as I've always said, why is it that people move from the global South to America? Well, it's besides economic reasons. The closer you are to the imperial core, the safer you are from its bombs. That's why you saw an influx of migrants in the 50s and 60s, moving to America for better prospects. Ironically, because America trashed their countries in the first place, right? But that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're really going to talk about is, why is American socialism so reactionary? Before you watch this video, it might be helpful to watch Second Thought's video entitled How America Ended Up with Two Right-Wing Parties. And if you notice, the historical trajectory of America seems to really mirror the historical trajectory of Malaysia, albeit with certain, differences in historical and material conditions. Malaysia also is dominated by two right-wing parties. There's the right-wing Pakatan Harapan, the Party of Hope, led by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. And on the other hand, there's the far right-wing National Socialists called the Perikatan Nasional, who are basically dominated by the religious theocrats who would like to turn Malaysia into some Taliban state. So the only reason many people vote for Harapan is for them to serve as a buffer against the far right-wingers. Just like how ethnic minorities in America don't really like the Democrats because they're not really very progressive, except on social issues, certain social issues, but they're not really progressive when it comes to economic justice or when it comes to making any meaningful change. But ethnic minorities like the African Americans may still vote for the Democrats because they fear that if Trump takes over, just like our Perikatan National, if Trump or the far right-wingers take over, well, they will suffer, you see. So there seem to be similar trajectories going on between Malaysia and America. So watch Second Thought's video first on why there's no real left in America. But in my analysis today, my thesis statement that I'm making at the front of this video right now is that there is no left in the developed world. That is to say, not just America, but Great Britain, Australia, Singapore as well, Japan, South Korea. There is no meaningful left wing. At least, don't get me wrong, there are people with left-wing sympathies and left-wing views, like myself, but unfortunately, in the developed, industrialized world, there is simply no meaningful or left-wing opposition, or at least no powerful enough left-wing opposition in order to combat the global capitalist hegemony, you see. Simply put, because the material conditions in these countries makes a true left wing difficult to form. And I'll explain further if you keep listening to me. So have you watched Second Thought's video yet? Yay, you have! Wonderful! I would clap for you if my right arm wasn't holding my camera phone, right? So, anyway, by now you should understand that, yeah, there is no true left-wing party in America, right? Not even Cornel West, who unironically praises Ronald Reagan, the neoliberal capitalist warlord Ronald Reagan, as a freedom fighter who helped to save the world from the evil, degenerate communists. Simply put, if you've noticed at what passes as left-wing in America, even the socialists, and I use the term very, very loosely, the so-called socialists like David Pachman or Vosch, don't seem particularly impressive when you consider that they support imperialist states like Israel, or basically, you know, they don't seem to listen to people in the global south, right? They usually have a majority white Anglo-Saxon audience, and they never seem to feature voices from the global south. And their version of socialism is not really seizing the means of production, you see. Their version of socialism is more like democratic socialism, Otto von Bismarck sort of socialism, Lee Kwan Yew sort of socialism, where basically they give you a welfare state. Basically, people like David Pachman will be pushing for something like a welfare state, where the state basically takes care of your needs, but the workers still don't own the means of production, right? So basically, no, the American left is not impressive, not to mention that it's so full of infiltrators, reactionary infiltrators like Jackson Hinkle, who call themselves Marxists or call themselves socialist progressives, but are unironically good friends with people like alt-right guru Gonzalo Lira, right, who hates communism with a passion, hates China with a passion, who actually said that the smart Chinese went to Taiwan, right? Yeah, that is the kind of person that Jackson Hinkle consorts with, the so-called American communist, Jackson Hinkle, right? So it's, I'm very, very skeptical about a true revolution taking place in America, because like my friend Ken said in his latest comment that I've pinned, and I've even shared it on the community post, a true socialist revolution would be impossible to take place in America, at least now. because America is simply too reactionary for that to happen, right? But I'm going to extend this even further to most civilized, developed countries like Japan, Singapore, the UK, or even Australia, right? Simply because those countries are far too reactionary for socialism ever to take place, right? Even socialists in America, like Midwestern Marx, find themselves pandering to reactionary elements by punching down on vulnerable groups, such as people on welfare, right? Or at least they don't openly punch down on them, but they endorse people like Oliver Anthony, who punch down on poor people receiving welfare, right? And the fact of the matter is that I'm part of the Parti Socialist Malaysia, right? The Socialist Party of Malaysia. Many of us come from different religious backgrounds. And of course, not all of us, certainly not all of us would approve of things like LGBT or, gender non-conformity or things like that. But when we step into our socialist headquarters, or when we step into our socialist uniform, we are no longer Christian, Muslim, Buddhist. We are no longer Malay, Chinese, or Indian. We are simply socialists trying to better our country, right? And unfortunately, although socialists in the global south do not mix religion or do not mix their personal biases with socialism, because that's undialectical to do so, American socialists seem to have this habit of pandering to the most reactionary elements of the working class, basically. Some of them even going so far as to say that, working class people are supposed to be reactionary, which they don't realize how insulting that is to normal working class people who are not hateful bigots like them. I was told by people from Infrared Haza's group that I do not belong to a social chauvinist. I do not belong to a socialist party. I belong to a social chauvinist party. Yes, Yankee Tanky, Haza's general, has said that I hate the Malaysian working class because we do not approve of discrimination against the LGBT community. Discrimination or harassment or persecution of the LGBT community is strictly opposed or sternly opposed by the Malaysian Socialist Party. And because of that, I was accused by people in the American Socialist right-wing MAGA communist group of belonging to a social chauvinist party, as if every Malaysian working class person is supposed to be a reactionary bigot, right? Look, the obvious fact is that American socialism is heavily corrupted, right? Unfortunately, American socialism is filled with right-wing hijackers like Samira Khan, Jackson Hinkle, and Caleb Maupin. Maupin's a spanker, by the way, or a spankee, sorry. He likes getting spanked, which is, by his own logic, degenerate. But I just have to say that American socialism has been badly hijacked, right? By right-wing reactionary opportunists who are basically pushing the anti-degeneracy line in order to alienate and isolate members or people of the community that they don't like, right? Basically, they're basically the New Age National Socialists, basically these LaRoucheite gang, who are trying to bring about socialism, but only for people who are like them. That means conservative, Christian or Muslim, gender-performing people. But you see, people who don't fit their anti-degeneracy worldview can go to hell for all they care, right? Because they don't actually care about every single strata of society. They only care about people who conform to their worldview. And Cornel West describing Ronald Reagan as a freedom fighter, supposedly the symbol of socialism in America. Cornel West describing Ronald Reagan as a freedom fighter is simply the cherry on top of it, right? That is the least odious thing I've seen. Do you want to know what's one of the most odious things I've seen? Or I have literally seen American communists fawning over Lee Kwan Yew. Yes, Lee Kwan Yew, the neoliberal Singaporean leader, who basically used the moniker of Asian values to disguise his own Bismarckian tendencies, his Bismarckian Thatcherian neoliberal tendencies, right? Lee Kwan Yew, that every single American Republican politician has a secret boner for, right? From Thomas Sowell to Ronald Reagan, every American right-wing politician has considered Lee Kwan Yew to be a very, very, very reliable friend in Southeast Asia. Just like the National Socialist leader of Malaysia, Tun Dr. Mahathir, Lee Kwan Yew has been very, very, very efficient in hounding and persecuting communists, right? And ironically, you have American communists, right-wing American communists like this fella here, praising Lee Kwan Yew as a true communist, right? Now, this is not simply contrarianism. It is not simply, a way to get back at the woke leftists, because Lee Kwan Yew is hardly what you would describe as a wokeist, right? This is one of the most odious forms of revisionism, to even say that Lee Kwan Yew was good for socialism, that Lee Kwan Yew was good for socialism in our region. Because Lee Kwan Yew was vicious towards communists, right? Lee Kwan Yew had Marxist literature banned. He had Marxists and communists locked up. And he certainly was no friend of communism. In fact, I dare say that Lee Kwan Yew even set back the communist or the socialist revolution, not by 10 years, but by 50 years at least. Because reactionary brainwashing is so firmly entrenched in the American zeitgeist that even American socialists, and again I use that term very loosely, who think they are not brainwashed because they've read Lee Kwan Yew's memoirs, right? From Third World to First, right? I have too. They think they're not brainwashed because they've read a Global South voice, right? Actually, Singapore is part of the Global North. But they think they're not brainwashed, are still brainwashed because they were probably pointed to Lee Kwan Yew by their college professors, I suppose, right? Because the American establishment loved Lee Kwan Yew because Lee Kwan Yew was a very, very, very reliable proxy, colonial surrogate to have in Asia, right? Because Lee Kwan Yew was not some rough and rugged Chinese working class man who rose up despite the odds against him. Lee Kwan Yew was part of the colonial elite intelligentsia who pretended to be an anti-colonial fighter after the British left. But in reality, it was men like Chin Peng and Rashid Maidin who were the true anti-colonial fighters. Men that Lee Kwan Yew would have locked up. Well, he would have locked up Confucius as well. He would have ordered that Confucius get a haircut since he didn't like long hair on men, but that's really beside the point. To say that Lee Kwan Yew was good for socialism in Singapore was like saying Ronald Reagan was good for socialism in America. Pretty soon, these so-called patriotic American socialists are going to be praising Ronald Reagan as more communist than the degenerate leftists. But it's incredibly insulting to the actual communists in Malaya who did the heavy lifting against the British and the Japanese, who actually fought them and sacrificed their lives to fight them, to say that Lee Kwan Yew, a colonial stooge, was indeed good for decolonization, was good for the spread of communism in the region. Because that's not what this man Chin Peng said, right? That goes entirely against the narrative of Chin Peng, right? These so-called American communists have read Lee Kwan Yew's book. They've read the books of Western scholars, but have they actually read books written by communist leaders in the region? No, they haven't. Have they read about Lim Chin Siong, the Singaporean communist leader who was hounded and persecuted by Lee Kwan Yew? Have they? Who was tossed aside like a used tissue once Kuan Yew had no more use of him, was locked up in the communist purges known as Operation Cold Store, and by all accounts, psychologically tortured in prison. No. You can't even call yourself a communist in Singapore without being treated like a criminal. So how dare you compare Lee Kwan Yew to someone like Chin Peng? That is a grave insult to our revolutionaries who gave their lives fighting the colonial power and tried to create a fair, just, and equal society for all. And by the way, Lee Kwan Yew was not only a race realist who believed that certain races were smarter than others. Lee Kwan Yew was profoundly elitist, right? Lee Kwan Yew did not like working class people. Yes, Lee Kwan Yew actually conducted policies or proposed policies that would favor graduate people, basically people with university degrees over working class people, at least basically in order to encourage people of non-working class backgrounds to produce more, because he thought white-collar people were smarter than blue-collar people, right? He encouraged graduate men to marry graduate women because he thought, if you marry a blue-collar woman, your kids are going to turn out stupid, right? That is hardly the Marxist line, because Marxism, objectively speaking, is supposed to be the emancipation of the working class. The revolutionary subject under Marxism, and I'm not even a Marxist, is supposed to be the working class that Lee Kwan Yew had a dim view of, because Lee Kwan Yew was a Fabian socialist, right? He didn't think that working class people, while they should have rights, he didn't think that working class people should reproduce, or at least they should reproduce as little as possible, right? That is not the pro-proletariat line. So I find it ludicrous that these American communists would even lump Lee Kwan Yew in with the likes of someone like Karl Marx, because no matter how reactionary some of Karl Marx's Victorian views were, there is no way you can compare someone like Marx to Lee Kwan Yew, or, because Lee Kwan Yew was an elitist. The school systems in Singapore are themselves elitist, because the best resources and the best teachers are given to the most promising, the strongest and most promising students, while the weaker and less promising students are basically left behind to drown. That is exactly how Lee Kwan Yew wanted it, because he thought it would be a waste of resources to pour them in less promising people. There is hardly anything socialist about it. Now, what is socialist about Lee Kwan Yew is, of course, the fact that Singapore is, more of a welfare state than America. Yes, you can say that. Singapore's healthcare is certainly better than American healthcare. But even Otto von Bismarck was the first German chancellor to actually propose universal healthcare, because universal healthcare is not itself socialist. Now, it helps the working class, but just because you propose universal healthcare, just because you propose welfare policies, like UBI, Universal Basic Income, it doesn't make you a socialist. I mean, forget about Lee Kwan Yew. Look at Singapore right now. Look at Singapore. Is it by any stretch of the imagination a country where the working class have control over the means of production? No, because everybody knows that white Western expats in Singapore are the labor aristocracy, right? Lee Kwan Yew brought in white Western expats by his reasoning to keep Singaporeans competitive, right? But in the end, what happened was the white Western expats ended up becoming the labor aristocracy. So not only did Lee Kwan Yew basically, end any chance of a communist or socialist takeover in Singapore for the next couple of decades after his death, Lee Kwan Yew also basically screwed over the Singaporean working classes by bringing in hordes of Western expats to keep them competitive, right? And the Western expats end up becoming the labor aristocracy. And I could go into the white worship of Singapore, which is even worse than the white worship of Malaysia, but that's not the point of this video. I don't want to create a rift between expat workers and local workers. That's not really my intention, because that's basically what the capitalists want. The capitalists want the workers to be divided. They want the local workers to feel resentful to the expat workers for getting better packages, and they don't want unity among the workers. So that's not really my intention, to insult expats working in Asia, because not every one of them is a Sapenza, okay? Not every expat is a rabid racist like Sapenza. Even if they have an Asian wife, it doesn't mean they're a rabid racist. And if I was a white Western expat, and I found that I wasn't doing so well in my country, who knows? I might go to another country in order to get a better life for myself, right? As long as expats respect the laws, respect our cultural norms, and try to see things from the local point of view, I really, really don't mind them. I'm actually happy to have them around. But it's revisionist to think that Singapore is anywhere close to a society that Marx or any other socialist has envisioned. No socialist in my country, in his or her right mind, would deign to consider Singapore as a model to strive for, right? Because although it is a colorblind society, well, not exactly, because they do play racial politics in a more subtle way than Malaysia does, right? Lee Kwan Yew also used to play racial politics. Although Singapore is more colorblind than Malaysia, in the end it is still an elitist society with a tremendous wealth gap, and it's basically an Asian version of New York, which is not what we want to strive for, right? It's not only the American socialists who have fallen into these reactionary tendencies, like worshipping neoliberal Asian leaders like Lee Kwan Yew, right? But also, it seems to me that Western socialism in general focuses mainly on theory, debating theory, and basically very little praxis, if you will, right? In the sense that, people like Haas or Vosch will debate with their competitors from behind a screen, but they don't actually get down to the levels of the working class that have the most to gain and the least to lose. They go to the MAGA fellas, MAGA, the Make America Great Again fellas, are basically people with the most to lose and the least to gain from socialism, right? Just like Trump said, America will never be a socialist country, right? I thought Donald Trump made that pretty obvious. They go to the boat-owning petty bourgeois of MAGA and try to revolutionize to them, instead of going to the ghettos or the slums, they go to people who are already economically comfortable, right? And basically, Western socialism, in a sense, it seems to lack praxis in the sense that you don't see armed rebellions like what you see with the Malayan Communist Party actually picking up rifles and going out to fight against the British and to fight against the post-colonial governments. You simply didn't see that sort of thing with Western socialists. I suppose I could make an exception for the Irish socialists, right? Yeah, those guys are pretty respectable. But you don't see the same kind of praxis among civilized Western socialists, right? And basically, the reason is that basically for a revolution to happen, people have got to feel that they've got skin in the game. They've got something to gain and not much to lose, right? But unfortunately, in the developed countries, basically, people have basically gotten too comfortable. Or let me rephrase that. That's not a very good way of putting it, because there are still many people who suffer from poverty and deprivation in the developed world. I'm not discounting that, but simply put, let me rephrase that. The developed countries have too many reactionary elements for a true socialist revolution to take root, right? Because the developed countries have far more to lose and too little to gain. You remember at the beginning of my video how some American socialists were even talking about going back to the 1950s, presumably minus the racism and minus the sexism and minus the misogyny of the 1950s. But some American socialists actually, if they could go back to the 1950s, even at the expense of the global south, and Bernie Sanders included, do you honestly think that these people would support socialist revolutions in other countries? Would they? No, they wouldn't, as long as they get to fill their own rice bowl, right? As long as they are comfortable. Even Deng Xiaoping, right? Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who funded the Malayan communists in the 60s, right? Ended up simping for the Malaysian reactionaries when they offered him a better deal, right? Now, as I've said, critical support for China, but nevertheless, you can't blame me for feeling a little bit betrayed by Deng, right? Because Deng, basically, he starts out by funding the communists, continuing Mao's policy of funding the communist guerrillas in Malaya. But then, when the Malaysian government started forming ties with Deng, right? What happened? Deng turned his policy around, right? And instead, and in the early 80s, he calls Chin Peng to Beijing, and he says to Chin Peng, the Malaysian communist leader, look, I don't think that this war of yours is winnable, and now China and Malaysia have diplomatic relations. We're on good terms, and so we can't continue to finance you, right? And so that is why this last batch of money, this 4 million yuan, is the last batch of money you're getting from us, right? And I suggest that you use this money to try and set up businesses and prosper. You know, of course, Chin Peng used that last batch of money and continued his struggle to the bitter end, right? Until he was forced to give up in 1989 and sign the Hat Yai Peace Accords, right? But you can see that even in a developed country like China, right, which looks out for its own interests, right, they would support a Malaysian reactionary over an actual socialist revolution if it would help them to fill their rice bowl. And that is what we mean by Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism, right? That Deng Xiaoping, if it would help China, would rather support a reactionary. But like I said, the developed world if you've noticed, does not trend towards socialism when times are tough. No, the developed world trends towards fascism, right? And the fact of the matter is that, you know, if you really, really, really support socialist revolution and you want to create a socialist world, you're better off supporting socialist movements in the developing world, like the Philippine guerrillas, you know, the New People's Army, or the more pacifistic Party Socialist Malaysia, which I'm a member of. You're better off supporting, or at least throwing your moral support behind these groups than you are supporting, well, socialism in America, right? Or whatever candidates they throw at you, like, you know, basically people like Midwestern Marx, or people like Cornel West, the most milquetoast, reactionary even sort of candidates. Because the group, just like in human beings, groups with the most revolutionary potential are the ones with the most to gain and the least to lose. The countries also with the most revolutionary potential are the ones with the most to gain and the least to lose, right? So you are really, really better off supporting socialist revolution in the developing world. I'm very sorry if this hurts your feelings, but yeah, it's just I just have to be honest, right? Or at least support the developing world, whose soil is still ripe for socialism, which hasn't been corrupted by reaction yet, right? Which can still get socialism right, having not yet sold out to the reactionaries, right? Like the American socialists have, or like, you know, countries like China or Russia to a certain extent have, right? Yes, you have to be historically illiterate to say that Russia is, by any stretch of the imagination, a bastion of socialism, right? Because Russia, in case you didn't realize, went back to capitalism after Gorbachev, right? After Gorbachev. Gorbachev basically rode back on Lenin's progressive policies, right? And you can ask old people in Russia and what life was like in the USSR. They will tell you happy stories. They were much happier living in the USSR than they are living in Russia at the moment, right? And that's why I say our movements, our socialist movements, need to be strictly gatekept. We cannot allow reactionary tendencies to seep into our movement, right? It doesn't matter if the people themselves are reactionary, because that's our job in order to correct them and cure them of their false consciousness, right? But if somebody professes to be a socialist leader, right, and yet they're spouting reactionary bullshit like, keep your degeneracy to yourself, no LGBT, or any of that reactionary nonsense, we need to basically treat that person like a pariah. Because as a leader, as a socialist leader, you are held to higher standards than we hold the masses, right? One drop of poison spoils the entire vat of wine. Do you understand? You let in one reactionary, you give him a position of leadership, what's going to happen? Well, I'll tell you what will happen. This reactionary will start persecuting and alienating the more reasonable members in whatever socialist party you belong to, right? He or she will start bullying and persecuting LGBT people and turning them off from socialism. And when he or she gets power, guess what? He or she is going to lock up their political opponents, like Lee Kwan Yew locked up Lim Chin Siong, right? Yes, that's what's going to happen. Lee Kwan Yew also called himself a socialist at one point, but of course he locked up the communists. He was a Fabian socialist. But the point I'm trying to make is we need to have standards, you see. And unfortunately, in the developed first world, it seems that the standards for being leaders in socialist parties seems to be very damn low, right? It's just enough that you've read Capital or you've read the Communist Manifesto. That's already enough for you to call yourself a socialist leader. Doesn't matter if you consort with reactionary elements. Doesn't matter if you basically encourage people to hold reactionary views. Doesn't matter if you bring in people who want to murder certain members of the community, like transgender people. Doesn't matter, because all that matters is that you've read Capital. And to me, that's a damn low standard. And unfortunately, American socialism seems to have a very, very low standard, right? Because basically, what they truly want, what these American socialists, even like Midwestern Marx, want, when they say popular American values, what they want is their 1950s white picket fence lifestyle, right? When they push for the re-emergence of the nuclear family, that itself is a dog whistle against so-called degenerates, because nobody, absolutely nobody, is stopping them from having their traditional nuclear family, which, by the way, is a byproduct of capitalism, yeah, because basically families throughout history have always been multi-generational in most cultures. In fact, in most cultures around the world, a child is a child of the village, right? Not a child of mother and father, but a child of everyone in the village. That's why in our culture, we call everybody who's an older man or woman uncle or auntie, right? Because in most cultures around the world that have not been corrupted by the capitalist mind virus, we still think about the collective good. To me, this idea of reviving the nuclear family or promoting popular American values simply doesn't work, because what happens is basically popular American values, as we currently know it, is, well, Puritanism combined with rugged individualism, right? And the American nuclear family, separated from other families by the white picket fence, is basically antithetical to the collective spirit, right? Because you're not only supposed to consider your own children, or rather you're not only supposed to care about your own children, but in an actual socialist society, you have to care about every child in the village, right? But the American socialists don't like that. They say, oh no, that's reactionary. The nuclear family is a sign of progress. No, it's not. It's a sign of capitalist degeneration. I don't use the word degenerate, but degeneration fits, right? Because basically, what they want is not really a revolution. What they want is not a socialist society where everyone looks after everybody and we're all members of one body, but they want a society like 1950s America, where everybody gets their 1950s nuclear family lifestyle. At least everybody who conforms to their standards, right? Not everybody. Only people who conform to their standards gets it. And that is why, simply put, basically, American socialism is itself a contradiction that's irreconcilable, because America in its current state, at least the America in its current incarnation, is bourgeois to the core, right? And these American socialists, simply put, don't want to give up on their bourgeois values, their rugged individualist bourgeois values, right? And second of all, they don't seem very tolerant of alternative forms of families. Like, when they say nuclear family, it's actually a dog whistle for anti-degeneracy, right? But also, you can just see how vehemently opposed most of these mainstream American communists like Midwestern Marx or people like Jackson Hinkle are towards landback, right? And you know for a fact that they don't want to get rid of the current incarnation of America, a puritanical European settler colonial state, right? Because it suits them. America in its current image suits them. If anyone in the global south, including myself, were to say that for the world to live, America must die, these American socialists like Midwestern Marx would take offense at that, right? They don't want to rewrite the Constitution and symbolically kill the current incarnation of America and replace it with an America of the Native Americans. No, they don't want to do that because they like America as it currently is. But unfortunately, that contradiction is way too much to handle. Because America as it currently is a reactionary bourgeois settler colonial state, you see? And that's mild. I mean, Midwestern Marx is mild compared to people like Jackson Hinkle, who in one breath call themselves socialists, and in the same breath call them, unironically support manifest destiny. Yes, there is no revolutionary potential in these first world socialists, simply because not only do they refuse to engage with people from the third world, or constantly ignore revolutionaries like Chin Peng or Thomas Sankara. Instead, they prop up China and Russia as models of socialism that we've got to follow, and they call everybody who's not on board with them a purity fetishist, right? Not only that, basically, these people don't want a revolution. They want a career. If they wanted a revolution, they wouldn't try to divide the workers by saying shit, gaslighting, or shit like, oh, baristas are not real working class. Why do you have to target baristas of all people, right? These people want a career, not a revolution. Because once a revolution happens and society becomes socialist, well, they become superfluous because they have nothing to contribute. They don't work. They only debate theory all day. We Global South socialists actually have real jobs. I engage with the people. I teach my students about socialism, and basically I answer any questions their parents might have. We actually get down to the people and talk to them. Once a revolution happens, all these pundits like Jackson Hinkle, Midwestern Marx, and so on will be irrelevant because they will have to get a real job too. Wouldn't it be awful? Well, that's about it for today. So I just have to say thank you very much for listening to my video. And if you are a socialist in the developed world, like if you're in a country like America or Singapore or South Korea or the UK, I'm not saying that you don't have revolutionary potential. I'm not saying that. But the revolutions in developing countries, as I've stressed time and again in this video, have more potential than the revolutions in developed countries. Simply put, because most developed countries, in order to get that state of development, have had to sell out to the capitalist powers, right? There's just no other way of putting it. I'm sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Tak ada gunung terlalu tinggi buat kami daki tengah panas. Tak ada lurah terlalu dalam buat kami masuk dalam kegelapan. Hutan rimba, padang lalang, dusun sunyi, jalan yang jauh. Panas terik, hujan berangin, maju terus, maju terus. Haram patah hati kami, kerana telitinya barisan gurila Malaya hancurkan musuh semua.